Hello, in this video we'll be going through Bio Revision Paper 1 for the WA2. So let's start off with the transport implants questions. So question 1 says which option correctly identifies the vascular tissues that transport amino acids, mineral salts, sugar and water in the plant. Now first thing first, remember when I refer to the vascular tissue in the plant, it refers to both the xylem and the phloem that is inside the leaf, the stem, etc. Do take time to remember the positions of the xylem and the phloem. So I'm drawing the stem right here. So in the stem, we have learned this in Sec 2. We have the vascular bundles arranged as such in the stem, and then the xylem is the vessels that are facing inside. So this is the xylem, and then the outermore vessels will be the phloem. In the leaf, right, usually the xylem and phloem will be bundled in the middle, and then we will have the xylem on top, on the upper surface of the leaf. And then the phloem will usually be found at the bottom. Okay, so coming back to the question, where are all of these things being transported? So water and mineral salts, these are transported by the xylem, whereas amino acid and sugars, sugars in the form of sucrose, will be transported in the phloem. So the answer is B. At this point, let me remind you of one of the important words in our syllabus, that is translocation. You need to be aware that translocation is the transport of manufactured food in the form of sucrose, as well as amino acids through the phloem. So essentially, translocation is just transport of food lah. Okay, remember, as the plant makes food, food is made in the form of glucose, but in order to transport it, they have to convert the glucose into sucrose. Okay, now question 2, which of the following correctly states the pathway in which water molecules leave a plant during transpiration? So here is another big word that you got to know the definition for. So a little bit of a recap. Transpiration is the loss of water vapor. To remember to write it in the form of water vapor instead of just water. Okay, so at this point, let me bring you back to your notes, right? When we think about transpiration, we think about how water moves out from the xylem, passes through the spongy mesophyll, and then they will leak out into this thin film of moisture, or thin layer of moisture around the spongy mesophyll. Then water will evaporate, so the important word here is evaporation, and evaporate into water vapor, and the water vapor will diffuse out of the stomata. So when you think about transpiration, do remember this picture and remember all these processes. So first things first, you have evaporation, and then you have diffusion of the water vapor out of the stomata. Okay, so in your notes, box 1 and 2 describes the process of transpiration. Okay, so coming back to the question, remember the story first begins at the vascular bundle, specifically at the xylem. Then water moves to the spongy mesophyll through osmosis, and then will evaporate into the... Oh, actually not yet. Yeah, and then they will move out to form the thin layer of moisture around the spongy mesophyll. Then water starts to evaporate into water vapor in the intercellular airspace, and then will diffuse out of the stomata. So the answer here is C. Okay, last one. Which of the following adaptations result in the greatest reduction in water loss from the leaves of a plant? So which of these adaptations help the plant to lose water lesser? So the answer here would be the thin needle-like leaves For example, those in cacti in the desert. So remember, in the desert, right, it's very hot. The cacti is a plant and still needs water, so it has very thin needle-like leaves, and that is the best adaptation for cacti, so that it can lose water the most. Over here, I have other pictures. What are microscopic hairs on leaf surfaces? So I think you might have seen such leaves before. This is an extremely zoomed in picture of the leaves, and you can see on these microscopic hairs. What these hairs will do, right, is that they help to trap water vapor. So as water vapor diffuses out of the stomata, water vapor can actually be trapped between the hairs. Okay, and this will cause there to be a higher concentration of water vapor outside the leaf, and then this causes the concentration gradient of water vapor to be less steep. Of water vapor. And hence there is a lower rate of water loss by transpiration. Okay, I think some of you, if your limbs have more hair, you might be able to experience this as well. After PE, right, whatever sweat that forms on your skin, if you have a lot of hairs, then the sweat kind of like stays on your skin. Whereas for those of you with lesser hair on your limbs, once you sweat, right, the sweat will quickly evaporate. So this is what hair does. So yes, this is quite a good adaptation for reducing water loss in a leaf, but it's not as good as not having leaves at all, like in the cacti. Okay, the other one I want to talk about is the sunken stomata in the leaf. So you know how normally stomata are found like that on leaves, so they are just exposed, right, and water vapor can diffuse out. But in some leaves, they have sunken stomata like that. So you see in this underneath, in the lower surface of the leaf, right, the stomata is not as exposed, so they look like that under the microscope. If you were to look at a transverse cut, you would see that the surface of the leaf is kind of like bent inward, and then the stomata is found in all of these pits. So this actually helps to reduce water loss as well. How does it do that? So any water vapor that gets diffused out of the stomata, right, will be trapped within the pit itself. So this causes there to be a higher concentration of water vapor outside the leaf, because all the water gets trapped, right? Can you see? Everything that diffuses out, right, will just remain inside here. This causes there to be a less steep concentration gradient of water vapor, and accordingly there will be a lower rate of water loss by transpiration. Okay, so once again, this is quite a good way for the plant to reduce their rates of transpiration, but once again, it is not as effective as not having leaves at all, like in cacti. Okay, the structured question now. A student uses the apparatus below to investigate the rate of water loss from a leafy shoot. So the name of this apparatus should be familiar to you because we talked about this. This is called a photometer. So as the leaf loses water to the environment, this creates a suction force or a transpiration pool occurs, and then more water will be absorbed up the leaf, and that causes the air bubble or the meniscus of this air bubble to move. So the more the water the more the distance moved by the meniscus, that means there is a higher rate of transpiration or water loss. Okay, so this student is investigating the rate of water loss caused by changing temperatures. So over here, can you make a quick edit to your question? Here it doesn't make sense for the number to be 27 lah, so I changed the data point to 37. Now answering part A, describe in detail what the table shows us about water loss from the leafy shoot. So when they phrase the question this way, right, in detail means that you need to be able to quote numbers again. Okay, and describe here means you just tell me the trend. I do not expect any explanation. The explanation will come in part 2 of the question over here. Okay, so in order to describe, all I got to do is to quote numbers, right? As temperatures increase from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, the distance moved by the meniscus increases from 28 mm to 54 mm. Okay, writing this alone, the orange words give me 1 mark. But of course, the question wants us to link to water loss. So tell me how the distance moved by the meniscus links to water loss. So you need to say when the distance moved by the meniscus is higher, that means there is a higher rate of water loss. So these purple words will give you an additional 1 mark. Okay, then how do I explain this trend? So once again, remember when we think about transpiration, there are 2 main processes, right? There is the evaporation part first, from liquid water into water vapor, and then after that, then you have the diffusion. So increasing the temperature, right, will actually affect this first step over here, where higher temperatures will cause water to evaporate faster. Right, we know this since primary school science. If you have a puddle of water and then under hot sun, the evaporation rate will be higher. So more water is evaporated from a thin film of moisture surrounding the mesophil. And then there will be a higher concentration of water vapor in the intercellular air spaces that causes transpiration rate to increase. So a lot of words for this 1 mark. Now next, they are asking us, what happens if this student now tries to cover the lower surface of the leaf with grease? Grease is like oil, so oil is not permeable to water, or we say that it will prevent water from passing through, water vapor as well. Okay, so we are to briefly describe how water loss in this experiment would compare with the water loss at 30 degrees Celsius in the original experiment. So if you look at the answer key, right, you have to compare your expected data with the actual data given in the experiment here. So you have to tell me how, if I cover the lower surface of the leaf with grease, will the distance moved by the meniscus be at 37 mm or more than or less than 37 mm? So you do need to make that comparison back to the original data. Okay, so the thing to remember here is that the lower surface of the leaf has a lot, or has the majority of the stomata. So if you cover the lower surface of the leaf, right, you expect there to be lesser water loss because most of the stomata is being covered, right? Hence, the distance moved by the meniscus will be less than 37 mm. So you do need to draw your data point or your answer back to what's happening at the original experiment. Okay? If the student repeats this part but now covers the upper surface of the leaf where there isn't much stomata, then the rate of water loss will be almost the same, and hence the distance moved by the meniscus is about 37 mm. Okay, so here is the explanation mark, 2 marks. So tell me what's happening at part 1, and then another mark will be given to what's happening at part 2. So if you cover just the lower surface, then that will block out most of the stomata. Hence, there will be really lesser transpiration. But if you just cover the upper surface of the leaf, then most of the stomata will still be exposed, so there is a similar rate of transpiration. Okay, so 1 mark for each of these points. The last question here asks me what I would expect there to be if I increase light intensity. So remember, at higher light intensity, the stomata of the leaf will open wider, and hence more water vapor can be lost, and hence rate of water loss increases. Here, each color represents 1 point in the answer. Alright, now moving on to organisms and the environment. Here we have a figure showing the pyramid of biomass constructed based on the food chain in the rainforest. So the thing to remember about the pyramid of biomass is this. It is essentially a picture to show us the total amount of mass of the organisms in the different trophic levels. Okay, and based on this pyramid, I can deduce that the fresh leaves is in trophic level 1, slugs trophic level 2, then you have the thrushes and the sparrowhawks. So based on this, if I were to reverse engineer the food chain, it looks like that. The fresh leaves are the producers in trophic level 1. This is eaten by the slugs, which are in turn eaten by the thrushes. And then last but not least, the thrushes are eaten by the apex predators, and we call them the sparrowhawks. Okay, the thing to remember about food chains is this. Every time we go past from one trophic level to another, energy is being slowly lost, right? In fact, at the end of the day, only 10% of the energy is passed down. So as energy is slowly lost, so by the time we reach to the 4th trophic level, there's not enough energy to support the entire food chain anymore. That is why in terms of the pyramid of biomass, we usually say that the organisms occupying the first trophic level will have the largest biomass. This is usually the trend lah. Okay, so answering the question which of the statements is true, of course, because the fresh leaves here, we see a longer bar, so there is a greater biomass, okay? The sparrowhawks here are supposed to have the smallest biomass. Okay, and according to the length of each bars, I know the slugs have a smaller biomass than the fresh leaves, and then the thrushes have more biomass than the sparrowhawks. So the answer is A. Okay, next one, which of the following statements about the food chain below is true? I know in the printing that I gave you, there are just empty boxes, right? But each box represents an arrow. Okay, so based on this food chain, even though I don't see the names of these organisms, I know that A is the producer in the food chain. It occupies trophic level 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this topic, right, you can use a lot of common sense to try and figure out which statements are correct. So it says a decrease in population C, so if there's lesser population C, is inevitable if the habitat of population B is destroyed by human activities. So if we destroy the habitats of population B, right, that means the number of population B is going to decrease. If that happens, then there will be less food available for C. So if C has less food, yes, then I would expect that the population of C will decrease. So 1 is logical. Statement 2, organism B needs to consume more food than organism D and is not a meat eater. That's a bit strange. Number 1, organism B is in trophic level 2. It is eating A, which is the producer. So it's likely that B is probably a herbivore or a plant eater. Not only that, right? Because B is only a trophic level 2, so it will be able to receive this more energy from each unit of food than organism D. Organism D is on the highest trophic level. It is at trophic level 4 in this case. So any unit of food that it is eating, right, is going to be having very little energy left. So organisms in the highest trophic level will need to eat more of the of food. Okay, so number 2 is wrong. Let's look at statements 3. It says an increase in population D is only possible if population C remains stagnant. So if the number of population C remains the same, right, then that means that the amount of food is available for D is the same, right? So this doesn't mean that if I have the same amount of food, doesn't mean that the number of organisms in population D will increase, right? It's like if I eat one filet o fish every day, doesn't mean I will get fat, right? I'll probably have the same weight. Okay, so 3 is also not logical. Let's look at statement 4. Statement 4 says the population of C will increase if the birth rate of organism B increase. So if birth rate of organism B increase, that means the population of B will increase, and then there will probably be more food available for C, and hence I know that population of C will increase. So statement 4 is also logical. The answer should be B. Okay, the last MCQ here. Which events in the country would directly increase its carbon sink? Let's recap what a carbon sink is. A carbon sink is kind of like a permanent store, a permanent and a, okay, maybe not permanent, but we say it's a long-term store of carbon inside our environment. So on the earth, we have 2 types of carbon sinks. The first one are forests, because there are so many trees, right? So each tree itself contains a lot of carbon. Another type of carbon sink we have on earth is the oceans or the sea, right? So there are a lot of organisms, a lot of water plants inside the ocean. So that's also a long-term store of carbon. Okay, so the question wants us to find out which events will directly increase. Okay, so let's read the options. Statement 1, an active enforcement of its reforestation laws. So reforestation means you build more trees, right? You conserve the forest. So yes, this is going to benefit the carbon sinks in terms of its forest. Next one, an increase in the percentage of human population becoming vegetarian. So if everybody becomes vegetarian, right, then we will probably have lesser plants available, right? If there's lesser plants, then it's likely that carbon sinks are going to shrink. Not only that, right, if you have more vegetarian, then probably the forests are going to get depleted. So this is unlikely to cause an increase in carbon sink. Next option, a reduction in fossil fuel mining on its land. So fossil fuel mining, later we will learn in chem. Fossil fuel mining requires you to basically do deforestation, right? And then you are going to clear large swaths of land and dig underground. So this in itself is going to cause a lot of the carbon sinks to be gotten rid of. So here it says a reduction, right? So if you have lesser deforestation, lesser digging, then yes, you're going to have more carbon sinks. Last one, reduction in the use of harmful pesticides on its farmland. So if you reduce the amount of pesticides being used, that means that probably your crops are going to be damaged, right? They might have be more susceptible to diseases by insects. So then the amount of plants available is going to decrease. So this is going to cause a decrease in the carbon sink. So the answer should be 1 and 3 only, B. Alright, let's go on to the structured questions. So this is an O-level question. Here we have a figure showing an example of a food chain. We have grass being eaten by crickets, which is in turn being eaten by birds, right? So use the information above to complete the pyramid of biomass in the diagram below. So we are looking at information about the biomass. So once again, biomass refers to the mass of all the organisms in that population at a particular period of time. So when we're sketching these types of graphs, right, remember this is really like any type of line graph that we are drawing. The number of squares that represent 100 kg should be proportional. So in this case, right, we have 5, 10, 15, 20, no. Right, how many squares here represent 100 kg? So we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So I have 50 squares here representing 100 kg. So on the next trophic level, when I only have 10 kg worth of crickets, then I should only be using 5 units to represent that. Okay, so kind of aim in the middle. So this would represent 10 kg of crickets. So in the exam, make sure that you are doing this in a proportionate manner. You can label the pyramid of biomass outside. Okay, then now let's move on to the birds. So birds here, we only have 1 kg. So 1 kg, we only probably need 5 divided by 10, right? So that will be half a unit. So because there's 0.5, right? So make sure you draw it accurately. Make sure it's only at 0.5. Yep, so this label it as well. This would represent 1 kg of birds. Okay. Now, next question. Why does biomass decrease from one trophic level to the other? And indeed, that's what we see, right? On the first trophic level, the grass occupying trophic level 1 has 100 kg of biomass. But as we go up to level 2 and level 3, we see a slow decrease in the biomass. So essentially the question is asking, right, how come I cannot afford to have more organisms on the higher trophic levels? How come I cannot have, it's not possible to have 100 kg of grass here, 10 kg of crickets, and then how come I can't have 10 kg of birds here? How come the biomass will necessarily decrease? So what we are going to say is that the organisms on the lower trophic levels have to support the organisms on a higher trophic level. So that's why on organisms on a higher trophic level, right, you cannot have too many of it. If not, there's not enough organisms on the lower trophic levels to support them. Just a quick reminder here, when the question says support the organism, right, we don't mean like emotional support or physical support here. We mean like supporting the organisms in terms of providing enough energy for survival. Okay, so yep, that's that. So as we go from trophic level to another, a lot of energy is lost, right? So by the time you reach the higher trophic levels, there's not enough energy to support the organisms. Okay, now next one, the energy flow in this food chain is non-cyclical. So we are supposed to use an example from the above food chain to explain what non-cyclical mean. We should include information about the source of energy for the food chain in your answer. So here, right, the answer is very standard. It's also found in your notes, but make sure you have these themes. Okay, so first thing, tell me about the source of energy. So you say the source of energy for this food chain is the sun. Correct, it's always the sun because the first trophic level, we usually have a photosynthetic plant. It gets its energy from the sun. So the ultimate source of energy here is the sun. So now, once we answered that part, we have to answer what it means by non-cyclical. So when energy is transferred from one trophic level to the other trophic level, not all the energy can be returned back to the original organism. So we start off by giving an example of the grass and how the chlorophyll in the grass traps and converts light energy into chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates or glucose. Then the energy from this grass, right, will be passed to the crickets through feeding. However, not all of the energy will be passed on, right? Some of the energy is going to be lost as heat to the surroundings during respiration, and this energy is not returned back to the organisms. So it is over here that we bring in the idea of energy being non-cyclical. Okay, the blue part here corresponds to the question demand here, where we're supposed to use examples given from the food chain above. So I'm using very specific examples of the organisms like grass as well as the crickets, because that's exactly what was given in the original question. Okay, then the green part will answer the non-cyclical aspect of the question. Okay, last one. So the food chain in this example only has 3 organisms, and we have also learned that food chains rarely contain more than 3 or 4 organisms. So why is that so? Okay, the big idea here is that at every energy or at every trophic level, right, there must be enough energy to support the organism. However, at each trophic level, the energy will slowly be used by organisms for their own life processes, right? Like respiration, digestion, etc. At the same time, some energy is also lost as heat. So at the end of the day, only 10% of energy is transferred from one trophic level to the other. And if you have an extremely long food chain, then more energy is going to be wasted, and there's going to be insufficient energy left to support the organisms at a higher trophic level. So the answer is very narrative. You have to you have to bring in all these ideas about how at the end of the day there is not enough energy, because only 10% is transferred, right? The rest of the 90% is either lost or being used up in the various life processes of the organism. Okay, so in this topic, right, the answers are quite standard, but it is very narrative, so you have to practice writing it. Alright, now coming to the last topic of reproduction in humans. Question 1. If a woman started her menstrual cycle on 1st of April, when will her ovulation and next menstruation date be? Okay, so remember when I talk about the menstrual cycle, the two important processes are both ovulation and menstruation. So we say that in a typical 30-day cycle, days 14 is the ovulation day, and then menstruation is usually days 1 to 5 of the cycle. Okay, so here, if she started her menstrual cycle on 1st April, right, if I were to draw a timeline, I would expect that from the 1st to the 5th of April, this is when she has her menstruation, 5 days. And then I expect that ovulation day is going to happen on day 14. About 3 days before and 1 day after, we say this is the fertile period. Okay, so they're asking us when ovulation will be, probably April 14, because that's 14 days from 1st of April. Then when will the next menstruation be? So in May, right? Or probably in the next month. When will it be? So assuming a 30-day cycle, then the next period of menstruation here will probably be around 30th April to perhaps 5th of May, depending on how you count the first day. Okay, so the most appropriate answer here would be C. It's impossible to have both the menstruation and ovulation days on the same date. Next, what would most likely be the effect of cutting off the oviducts on both sides of a female? So an oviduct is the fallopian tube. What does the fallopian tube do? The fallopian tube is basically a tube that attaches the ovary. So this is the ovary, and this is the fallopian tube. So it attaches the ovary to the uterus. Okay, at the fallopian tube, we say that is where fertilization takes place, because the sperm has to swim up to the fallopian tube or the oviduct in order to meet the egg and then do the fertilization. So what's going to happen if she cuts both of these, right? This is usually what happens when females decide that they permanently do not want to have kids anymore. Okay, so that's the surgery option that they will take. In that case, she will become sterile. Sterile just means that she's not able to produce any more children. She can't produce any more children because it is impossible for the sperm to meet the egg, because now the highway has been cut off. Alright, the answer cannot be B because, the answer cannot be A. A says that she will not be able to produce eggs. That is not true because the ovaries are still present, right? We are not removing the ovaries at all. So the place where the eggs are being produced is the ovaries. If she still has her ovaries, she still can have eggs, just that the eggs cannot move into the uterus. Okay, has nothing to do with her urinary system. Okay, here we talk about follicles. Follicles not really in your syllabus, but it's essentially parts of your ovary as well. It is parts of the ovaries that will produce some of the female hormones necessary for ovulation. Now, question 3, we are looking at a graph showing the uterine lining thickness over a period of time. So, if we look at this graph stage by stage, when I see the uterine thickness decreasing, I know that this is probably indicating menstruation, because menstruation is the breaking down and shedding of the uterine lining, right? Then after menstruation, you see the uterine lining start to increase in thickness once more. So this is contributed likely due to increase in estrogen at the beginning, and then after that an increase in progesterone later on. But eventually we note in this graph that the level of the thickness of the uterine lining went back down. So this is to indicate that probably no fertilization has taken place. So we are looking at another round of menstruation. Okay, so according to this graph, which one will show a period of ovulation and fertilization? Okay, so ovulation will probably be in between where the uterine lining gets thicker. So answer is M. Okay, fertilization here, which one best shows when it is good to have fertilization? So it's good to have fertilization just right after ovulation. So the answer would be N. Best answer here would be C. Okay, and the last question here is a very simple question of how the hormone level changes with the uterine lining levels. Okay, so without any other description, you should probably note that this bottom part of the graph here indicates the thickness of the uterine lining. Whereas the top part of the graph will indicate the levels of hormones. Okay, so here of course we have two hormones at play, estrogen and progesterone. First question, you're supposed to tell me which is estrogen, which is progesterone, right? So if you look at what's going on here, you would see that levels of Y peaked right before the midpoint. So we usually indicate the midpoint as day 14, right? So at day 14, we know that there is ovulation. So the hormone that peaks right before ovulation is estrogen. This is how I know why it's estrogen. Okay, so make a note for yourself. Estrogen levels peak before, just right before ovulation. Whereas progesterone will peak after ovulation. Okay. At which stage does the menstrual cycle enter? When the concentration of Y decreases. So in this graph, when concentration of Y first decreases, that's indicative of this blue segment over here. So this is the period that intersects with ovulation. So I know that this is probably what the stage of menstrual cycle is happening. Okay, so once the levels of estrogen start to dip a bit, I know that's ovulation. Okay, during menstruation, what happens to the level of hormones of X and Y? So in this graph here, I know that menstruation is the breaking down and the shedding of the uterine lining, right? So at these parts over here and here, this is where I am likely to expect there to be menstruation, because the uterine lining is becoming thinner. So definition of menstruation is the breaking down and discharge of the uterine lining. Discharge means like expellation of it. Okay, so what's happening to the concentrations of the hormones? You know, during menstruation, your hormone levels are decreasing, or we can say that it's very low. Okay, if fertilization occurs, the menstrual cycle will stop and menstruation will not occur, right? That makes sense. If there is fertilization, then the embryo is going to implant itself into the uterine lining. There will not be any menstruation. Okay, so then X and Y will continuously be secreted. So what's the purpose of maintaining a lot of X and Y? What's the purpose of maintaining a lot of progesterone and estrogen? That is because these two hormones promotes the growth of blood vessels so that the uterine lining can remain thick for the implantation of the embryo and supplying the embryo with nutrients. Okay, so that's just a simple answer here. Alright, and with that, we're done with revision paper 1.